My hostel had no idea how to get to Astra, and the bus driver talked to one. He said, take buses 3 and 5, not 1, but 1's the one I'm on, because the lady told me this one will get me right to it, just go to the last stop. And you have to buy your ticket in advance, but there was no place to. I got on the bus and I just held on to my money, and then when the lady who was helping me got off the bus, it occurred to her she could give me her ticket, and she did. Okay, I got here at 9:10. That's about 50 minutes before it actually opens, but Roxanne, the young woman who takes tickets, sold me a ticket, said go on in. And she recommended I start on the left half because that's the technology half, and the right half is the residential area, and they're working on that right now. Also, I've seen a lot of that in Bucharest, so I want to go here and explore this. But this, to give you an idea, this is a pretty large complex. And I'll pan through this just in case at some point in time I want to have a better knowledge of this. This is the key, of course. Down the steps apparently from here and take a left. And I'm going to try to pick up this route here and around through there, and then down and back around some. This symbolizes a bird. It's an abstract version of. Here you get an idea of what a pretty layout this is with this large lake or pond. And I think there's more to the pond than this. It's in the Bravara forest area, and you can see this is very pretty. Now this is something someone from Jackson should be interested with, Jackson history at least. This is, I believe, a ferry, and it has cables that draw it back and forth across a river, and those pointy things probably keep it aligned. And the wheels, notice that they're wood, probably allow it to somewhat come up onto the bank or shore. And this device would have somehow been able to pulley it back and forth across somehow, unless its sole purpose was to put tension on the cable that holds, probably upstream cable that holds it, and that it does move back and forth across somehow. Now it may be that that's the front and that that's the rear, because notice that those pointy things look more like rudders and are hinged apparently, I can see. And this little structure is apparently the ferryman's house. Just as a little bit of background, this is the second largest open-air museum of its type in the world at 250 acres. And this is a big, heavy dugout canoe, or dugout. Notice it has holes in there. I'm not sure what those would have been for. Either outrigging, or maybe it had covers. Those are pretty substantial holes though. Or maybe it was used to keep the sides separated. A large barn-like structure filled with wagons and other kinds of transport. Remember, these all served a long time use. Look at the design here. That a man or woman carefully searched the woods for those 4 outrigger pieces that are attached to the axles. First time I've seen that design. I wonder if it, I was thinking it might have formed some kind of suspension, but I don't think so. Huh. And then you'd sit up there, just like the old stagecoaches. This band of steel, rough as it is, or iron rather, has been welded together around this rim, probably very much like our old wagons. It's a little trailer device that was used to haul long things, because I think these are the older units. This is probably again for hauling logs or things of that nature. Notice how you could adjust the length of this one. And here, forget what they call these. But a lot of animals sweat embedded in those. Rough but serviceable. And in their time, probably the zenith of their primitive technology. But imagine the skill of finding this wood and then fashioning it for this. Look at these elbows. And matched. So that's something else in those days they would have intuitively done, and that is as they walked through the woods, and even over time would have known where certain trees were growing that way and would harvest them when they were in the ideal configuration. Imagine this packed with straw or hay or whatever it carried. Technologies for getting into it. Isn't that interesting? Looks like they've fashioned a stirrup onto that piece of thin wood to get access. Huh. Isn't it a blessing that things like this have been preserved and protected? This is part of a braking mechanism against that wheel down there. I wonder if it really was the definable moment when the utilitarian added on the aesthetic. But notice how much more complex this one is. All kinds of metal gearing down in there. Same thing here. The hanes are more sophisticated. Here the basket itself was probably a real skill of a trade. And it has two parts to it, the back and the front. Interesting. I wonder if that had some flexibility to it. And could it have been covered? Notice how these serve as handles here. Was the size of windmills a evolutionary thing, or was it just what was designed for the task at hand? I wonder why the ends are open. Did that provide some kind of stabilizing effect with regard to wind? And notice that they're not solid, they're slatted, as you can see in this one here. Looking at the side of this one, what's notable are the two big logs going up there that are hooked to a wheel here. What was that function, I wonder? You can see the same idea on that back of that smaller one. Here more solid boards, it looks like, than the first one over there that was more slatted. In a moment we'll have a little bit of true nostalgia. I think this place was once designed, as was the one in Bucharest, to actually have people living in them. But that became too cumbersome to continue to execute. Perhaps a couple more either ferry boats or houseboats. Now this apparently was a platform that would lie flat on those extended beams. Now this is interesting. It was a paddle wheel boat with a outrigged extension boat, if you will. I wonder what powered this thing. A floating mill. Rather than being a traveling boat, it was a mobile mill that you would probably park, take it somehow and park it in the middle of a good water flow or at the end of a stream that broke into a lake, and that would be your power. The value was you could take this to many small communities that lived on a navigable waterway, a river, and provide the milling service at each village, which saved a lot of hassle and energy and time. And here it looks like still another similar to that. That's cleverly innovative. But what did we think? That they were stupid in those days? I think why we're amazed at these earlier technologies when we see them is because we're so ignorant of the history of the technologies we use today. Because in fact we would discover that much of what we do springs from what others had attempted or done in the past. Now what's interesting about this one is they use cloth as sails, and you wonder if they get somehow the benefit from the airfoil configuration of normal sails. And notice that this post comes out from the center, and all of these radiating posts are tied to it. Is that simply for support, or was there more that we're not noticing? Big steel or iron wheel attached to these logs. My guess is that somehow they're able to rotate that windmill to face the wind when they need to do it. Probably not on a moment-to-moment basis, but with a team of... Can't really tell from here, but looking at that wood underneath, my guess is that somehow that accommodated the turning of this windmill. Now, how much it could turn and what effort was required to actually do it, certainly look like the original posts that did it. And maybe this thing here had something to do with it also. Looking at this big one we saw earlier, the same design, except the man's opened up the door so we can see inside now. Now inside on the first story of this two-story windmill, and the first of two things I notice is, number one, this heavy, thick log as the primary post, and things could have rotated around that. Notice that it is designed for that. This is not held to that. And then the second thing I notice are these two wooden gears. So you had the technology of the gears with some iron, but they had not figured out how to use the iron as part of the gear, which is interesting, since that would have precluded wear. And about give us a sense of what it's like to be inside of a windmill. Who would have thunk? I mean, is this what makes travel exciting or what? Okay, so here we have probably where you threw whatever it was that was going to be ground, and those wheels in this bin where that stuff ended up. And this somehow, which could be turned perhaps on a screw of some sort or something, could adjust some mechanism down there. But there's your gearing mechanism. So the wind turns that huge shaft, and it in turn is connected, has a big gear on it, and then the smaller gear, and the same thing is replicated at the back end. And notice the pulleys designed for fine-tune adjustment, which seems like an oxymoron when you're looking at something as big and clunky as this. But remember, simply because you have a technology doesn't mean you have yet discovered the allied technologies of the materials that would make it most ideal. And notice the angle that this comes down at. Was that intentional? You would think so. This is a cute little windmill, if it's not a demeaning term. So here we have the same essential design with some metal as a slight variation to the theme. And you can imagine what the sounds might have been here, working in these close little quarters. And this looks like, yep, that's a actual stone. Mm-hmm. Down into there. Yeah, and then here would be the chute where the corn would be ground or whatever you were grinding. So if you take the old double stones of China, this is an advancement over that was dramatic, no doubt. But imagine the noise in here. The pleasant sort of irony in my visiting and exploring and probing the technologies of these earlier times with two titanium and plastic metal knee replacements, titanium teeth replacements, and a $1,200 video camera that would have been unimaginable at that time, I think. Although, weren't pictures created by artists the beginnings of that? Imagine what exciting times would have been here when the romances blossomed. And other intrigues were brought to a head. Imagine the weeks of imagining and hoping that you'd meet the person you wanted to meet here. Only the sounds could leap from this building. Certainly Spielberg could do it for us. Here another dance pavilion, and rightfully with a couple of hearts on it, because that had to be one of the great underlying themes for and about the use of these. Would this have just been a nice little picnic place? Or was it a bus stop house? So a combination of both. Now this is interesting, a double water wheel structure with two different size water wheels. What was the point of that? And then notice here that the water, you would bring water in. You didn't set it down in. You could actually bring water in from somewhere else, which gave you probably better control in flood season. And then you could siphon off that water through that chute that's coming directly towards us, or run it down through here and power your two wells. But notice it didn't take a lot of water to do it. Maybe 1.5 feet, if that much. Maybe about 3.5 feet. But one of the dangers for kayakers in a river is getting your kayak sideways on a bridge abutment or a log that's sticking up, because it will literally wrap the kayak around the log, entrapping the kayak. Here we see the function of, if not both, at least the smaller of those two wheels hooked up here to a piece of wood machinery, if you will. That was probably a stamping machine for some kind of... There's our water wheel shaft, and from it I suspect, yes, there's a belt going up. You can see it in the center just barely. And then on the right of my screen, through the wood, you may be able to detect another smaller wheel that drives the belt, that drives the machine we just saw. Now, whether they have combined these two water wheels' power together, I can't tell from here, and I'm going to pan down this beam just to pick up the initials and the names of people who scored it, and try to imagine, if you could, which you can't, who they were, why they put their names here. Did they work in here? Did they do this during lunch? Was it a tradition? Was it done afterward? It appears to give us some date. Approaching an open shed with a very large water wheel. Now, did the size of the water wheel have an effect on its power? Of course it did, but what, I don't know. Haven't thought of it. But just in the name and the year and the words used, overshot wheel, tells us there was something going on. Not to mention that there's a 2-gear transmission. This sophisticated use of metal, in other words that screw, if you will, why didn't they use metal gears? Was there some flexibility in the wood that was a benefit? Was the wearing something that was actually necessary and useful to what might be called an organic or living machine? The aesthetic carving along here, was that an afterthought, or something that someone who was creative did in their idle moment? Look at how that shaft has been hewn by hand, and yet girded by iron to hold it together. Imagine that there was a bunch of extra gears, I think, although this is a pretty hard wood. Could these gears be replaced? It looks like they could. See the nails holding those in place? Maybe you could pop those nails loose, and then it would just slide one way or the other and be... Are these the initials of the man who carved that intricate little gear? Imagine all around us there would have been bales or buckets or something filled with the stuff to be ground, and it was... somebody had to continually keep bringing it up here unless there were a way of hoisting it up. And then somebody would stand here and dump it in, and probably had to keep moving the stuff around inside the grindstone mechanism. These are probably just what they look like, sheds for animals, pigs or something like that. And had some other purpose. Large stone with a hole in the center. Was it a small grinding device? There's a water mill with an overshot wheel. Little wheel inside there. Wonder what overshot means. Sure looks busy. I wonder what that means. Notice how design has now involved itself with arches instead of something plainer and rougher. And yet, large hewn slab. You're planting a little garden. And what's this building? An oven for drying plums. So I don't know if there was any heat applied to this other than the heat of the day. It just may be a way of creating plums by the original grinding wheel. Whether it was, don't think the wheel would have, the shaft would have been that way. It would have been somehow different and more controlled. I'm not even sure that that wheel wouldn't have been reversed so that angle was in the opposite way. And then maybe turned by animals. But what's interesting is that large wooden bowl that it rides in. Was this created by, it seems like it would have been, several pieces of lumber brought together? I think so, and held with those metal bands. Just a heavy-duty press. Remember, if you can take the wool and compress it, get all the water out into a tight little bundle, easier to ship. More of it. Just a big old water wheel. Remember seeing these in China in actual use. Even the roof design is pretty, isn't it? Now it looks like this mechanism is suggesting that either water was brought from that water wheel down here to service this building, or water to lubricate. So it was water to power. Simple little building. Probably some reproductions of grave markers. Notable thing design-wise is that they went to the extra effort of creating this rounded end for the nave or the altar area. And this looks like it might have had some other function right in here, but I don't know what. Letting me inside by myself, asking me to rope off the door to others when I leave. Imagine when these pictures, when this artwork for so long was the salvation and the succor of the people who worshipped here. Interesting. Is that a symbol in the church that was a reflection of the agricultural way of life? Were these perhaps the 10 or 12 stations of the cross? They tied together those compound corners. It's for those people who worship. Now remember, in the old days in cathedrals you didn't sit down. So was this for important people, even in a small church? Large candlestick holder. It was a neat experience, eh? One of the benefits of being alone and early, when those people choose to grace you with that benefit. Okay, I came up that way and went over to look at this church, and I haven't done that area there, and I need to go back to my left. I'm going to make a loop around here to my right to look at some of what we're seeing right here. I'm not going to exit though. What a pretty little house that is, eh? Here, a press of some sort. Okay, here we get a fuller example than I've seen so far of the actual press section. You can see the holes there designed to push the fluid out. and then it flowed into that stone table, and then out through this face's mouth into a bucket. Smaller one. Looks like you would turn it with what looked like small handles, but my bet is that they had longer levers to make that work more easily. Now here it looks like a very large building filled with these presses and the various implements that were used with them. This was for the juice or not, I don't know. I'm guessing from the way it looks rotted out that it might have been, and this would have been the check dam for it. And a basket that held all the grapes, but would have used it for pressing, and the fluid came out through the sides and then out through there. Maybe so. There's just some smaller variations on the same theme. But imagine the skill of the person who carved those screws. And this, same idea. Yeah, could have had a box of some sort in there, like this is done here. Love the smell of this old wood. Look at the name in here. And now look at the size of what you could crush there. And now we're moving towards bigger, massive production of this process, which continues even today at its zenith. But just imagine, how did you move these timbers? How did you get them in place? That in itself was a technology. And look at the size of these pressing dowels. Imagine the accidents that occurred when these chains might occasionally break from fatigue. Because how would you know when they were going to break? They had no way of knowing that technology. Now see, here's what I mean. There's the steel or iron. Look how close they are to a gear. There must have been some reason they didn't do it. Was this just a flywheel, or was it a way for one man to, or two men to operate? This is interesting. If this is in the same configuration that it would have been horizontally, what was it pressing? I've seen things akin to this in my own travels in the country, in the United States, in antique shops. So look at the size of these things. Stones naturally round, or was there some reason why they made them round other than to move them around easily? You can imagine, look at the size of this, twice the size of the biggest one we've seen so far. So imagine here the size of this tray, for lack of a better term. Maybe some even bigger board was put in here, or maybe you kept lifting it up and pushing stuff underneath it and then pressing it back down again. Who knows? But certainly accompanying this monumental effort required to build these things, these people had the skill to know how to use them most effectively. So this was a flax press. Notice those devices on the side that are hammers like, and they look like they pivot. They do, they pivot up above. Probably designed to wedge in those pieces of wood. So that's how this thing worked. It worked by putting in huge wedges. Now, how did you get them out? That's what I'd like to know. The problem with a house like this is every once in a while you got to go through the major investment of effort to redo these roofs. But doesn't it look like they just went into town for a day or so and we're just having to run across their property? Their garden already planted and growing. Imagine when the man who and the family lived here knew intimately what those implements were for. Barrel maker's skill was well developed by then. And even this shed here, you can see how it incorporated an angle in order to bring that big door to a point. And I'm guessing that this hay and the vines that are on top of the hay to hold it in place are designed to protect that fence. Even this small building with its city eyes. So here, this press that we've been thinking might have been used for metal is used for a press for oil. So by pulling down on that string, it lifts over that pulley those pestles, if you will, and then you let it thunder back down. Imagine how tough those people were, since we sell exercise machines like that. Now here's a smaller version of that one that uses a wedging process. And I lament the energy that was required to use these things, but they probably thought, compared to what Dad and Grandpa used to have to do, we got it made. So this is a horizontal press. I don't see how it works except that by spinning that wheel, these screws bring those two pieces together, or separate them, not sure which, causing a pressing dynamic somewhere in that machine. And then notice this. Now this looks like it's set up for a mill to raise and lower those things successively. And that might have been an oven, either to take care of cold days, or maybe it was part of the process. So here's a big version of this trough and vertical wheel press. And maybe there was an animal that went around and round inside of that circle. Presumably when it was new, all of these seams were really tight, and somewhere here, on some angled sloping portion, the oil would have dripped out, I guess. But notice also an oven required for something. Yeah, driven by animal power. Of course, you have to remember that with the use of a chute like this, you could bring water from any place that was slightly higher and run your mill. Here again, it looks like a double wheel, although they're the same size. But they're offset a bit so that they don't use the same water source. Here's some older conveyances, a sleigh actually. Maybe a couple of sleighs, but that one in the center, probably one for people transportation with some bit of luxury. You can imagine them all bundled up in furs. Here we get an idea of how they would have covered these wagons. Don't know if we can poke inside and actually see. Here's a pretty entrance to this large complex. And there, notice another one of those little grain storage devices. This is a hand mill with a belt drive. But also, that looks like that large wheel is a flywheel. It does function that way. Now here we've got a water wheel that turns horizontally. So you drop water onto it. I've seen it before, but didn't see how it was connected up. Notice the water has to come in from the right side. And this, we've seen these kind of, I'm guessing they're thrashing machines do large volumes of whatever it is they do. But here, run off of a water mill. I didn't realize that was a way it could be done. But then a power takeoff or take on could be attached to any power takeoff. And notice now we've got metal gears over there, and notice that we've got a combination metal gear and wood gear, as well as a combination metal and wood flywheel. A wattled granary. Sure does look like critters can get in here easily enough. A very pretty design, to say the least. What I don't see right off is how they filled them, unless they lifted off part of the top. Here one more in the Spanish design where it's raised up. Still, I should think they'd want to put something on here to prevent mice from climbing up, but maybe it's just for hay, as it says, Slawn Hayloft. So maybe they didn't mind that the mice nibbled on some hay once in a while. You wonder what the motivation for the multiple designs were, other than just the natural creativity of man. In themselves, they're beautifully carved horizontal water wheels, if you will. And I wonder what benefit they offered as opposed to a vertical classic water wheel. Now this is interesting because it shows us how they bring in a large volume of water and then split it up to hit these wheels for the optimum power, I suspect. That's essential here because this has 3 wheels. One of the benefits of the horizontal wheel, I would bet, is, don't know what the power ratio differences are, but is that you have less mass. In other words, instead of those big honking vertical or horizontal axles attached to the wheel and then coming into the building, you have relatively modest ones, I think, and you don't take up so much horizontal real estate. It's kind of neat because it had a little bench for folks to sit on that were working here. Here, a little bit more modern machine, maybe brought along with this complex that's now being restored. He scampered away when I walked across the bridge, but he's returned. So I'll see if I can avoid disturbing him too much. And here, a double-seater Ferris wheel. Now, what I don't see here is how they operated it. Unless a couple people at the bottom could just keep pushing on their respective vertical shafts, causing it to turn enough. But I'll bet you tried to balance the people that were on it, so far as weight was concerned. Notice the nicely carved entryway. Now, I wonder if in this house animals were below and people lived up above. Here's a different version of our granary, but still not designed to keep critters out, so it wasn't necessary. Haven't they done a lovely job of making this seem like people actually live here? Here we can see how they set up the approach of the water to the water wheel. Maybe that other trough over there is just a bypass trough for excess water. And here in the approach you can see they've just put in a little innovation to keep logs and timber from getting into that area. And then you can see the check dam doors, if you will. They just simply lift them up or pull them out of place and the water rushes in. Here we can see that the people who operated the mill lived in the mill. Have their beds and so forth set up. So you worked all day. Right, and slept and lived right next to where you did your job. Makes sense. Now, in contrast to some of the others we've seen here, the 2 water wheels are aligned in the same trough. So one goes, both go. Okay, I'm back where I was a little bit earlier, because I want to see this water wheel system here, which is different. What's novel about this one is that with this winching device, you can then lift up, and notice it's counterbalanced there, you can lift up that whole water wheel and its shaft relative to the water level you're encountering. So that would allow you to compensate for spring runoff's too much water and summer's shortage of water. That's a clever innovation. And notice that they're using a all iron or steel chain to drive this water wheel. And it's in, not to mention that all of this is metal, but it must have required or required the technology of, I would think, cable making, but maybe they were able to use rope. Okay, at this point I probably have covered about a third of all there is to see here. So this is the country or pastoral section we're in now, and that means shepherding. This first little complex, notice the big slabs of log. I don't know if we used big slabs like that. I seem to recall pictures like from the Abe Lincoln era. Otherwise, in the West it was logs. Now the difference between the slabs use and the logs, you'd have less chinking, but you would have less horizontal mass, I think. Aesthetically, you might like the flatter walls. Investment was tremendous for this. They had to be sawn and then hand hewn, perhaps. The logs, you simply cut them, trim them, and you're ready to go. So this is like the hill countries that we've seen, although this is a sheep pen, not really a home. So I don't know what the room up there was for, but presumably the sheep would all be cowering underneath these roofs in bad weather. Now here, a pretty large building. So we're looking at log and probably log covered with plaster. Now this would be like those mountain homes that we were seeing in Bucharest, where Brasov is also a mountain town, where these were kind of like enclosures against the wilderness, if you will, for the mountain people. They're quite an elaborate little oven and stove that would have kept everything heated nicely, one hopes. But notice they had another big fireplace in this room. So, none in here. Maybe this is where you slept and you didn't really need it, but there were benches there. This looks more like the living room area. And with most structures that people build anywhere, you keep adding on when you have new additional uses. It's such a beautiful location and context for these old structures. It has the look of a barn. We'll see what it says. You wonder what that bench was for, not to mention that little device. Would that have been something to do with shearing? And notice the doors that allow ingress and egress for the sheep, I imagine. These are probably examples of makeshift enclosures, or rather refuges, against the wind and the cold that they created in the high sheep country. And maybe those were even cairns or something for marking out your pasture range, if in fact they delineated that. Still see buildings that look just about exactly like this up in Jackson Hole. Probably the sheep herders lived here, as well as those pots for doing whatever they did with either the sheep or the wool. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a dowel that goes through those shafts that holds the bucket at a certain height, probably above the flame. And then probably the sheep were kept in there, so You are on very intimate terms with the sheep. Little device for holding your door in place and being able to pivot it. Here's sheepfold with cabin. Now, to what degree the shepherd and his flock lived in this building, I don't know. But maybe the back part accommodated some of the sheep when weather was really terrible. Looks like just ordinary clover, maybe. Wonder if these are some of the examples of what I would see in Sapanta in northern central Romania. But this is 1991, maybe. I wonder if these folks are actually buried here. Wouldn't that be a quaint follow through on them? I wonder why we say rest in peace when you really have no option at this point. Unless it's designed to say, I hope you're going to heaven and not hell. This is a novel and yet pretty and functional for the heavy winters. It'd be interesting to be inside and see how it's constructed, but you can almost pretty much imagine. And here another building that looks like it's an actual building underneath that canopy. What's pretty here too is the tiles, or the shingles, and how they lay out so beautifully over this roof. And we may be able to get just a hint. Would have been a solitary life, but probably not a whole lot different than our Wyoming sheep herders who live in their traveling Canastota wagon type things. Okay, I've just switched from one SDXC to another, the second in the B position. Other than the roof, it could just as easily be seen in Jackson Hole. Although these lower extensions are novel, but maybe you can see in Jackson Hole it'd be useful for throwing a saddle over. Here's just a temporary shelter. I forget where I've seen shelters like this, but I think I've seen them in Ushuaia National Park. Of course, it's reminiscent of the Paiute Wikiup. No telling what this little enclosure would have been for. Maybe a rabbit hutch or something like that. I'm guessing this is a church, although I see nothing indicating same. I think it's just a very pretty building. I don't know what its purpose was. Here, an interesting sculpture. Whether it came from somewhere or not, I don't know. Another piece of playful park whimsy. So Bruce will not think me a total hypocrite. I have prudence in the form of soda water, or water with gas, and I of course have my hypocrisy here with my potato chips, but with chicken. So there's protein, maybe. Okay, it's just about exactly 3 hours it took me to get from over there, walk around the lake, see everything over there. You can see that windmill with sails, and come back down this road and get a bite to eat. So just the first 3 hours of today is worth 2 or 3 regular days at least, since it's so intriguing. Imagine what you would be doing if I were sitting in Arizona or in Jackson. Probably working on my computer or thinking of something to do. Not that I'd be bored, not that I would be unhappy. This is far more worthwhile. This is interesting. The water came in from there. And these are two. One of the three is offset. That one, little one over there. Then these are in the same channel. This is that conical thing for something, I can't remember the term, felling wool, something to do with wool. Notice how long this shaft is, probably to counterbalance the weight of the water wheel. I think is just a big wheel for doing that carding, cleaning of the wool. How they did it, I don't know. It's the same thing using that wicker or wattle design. This must have made a lot of noise in here, a sloshing noise with the wool. And it's surprising, this being metal, that they didn't have a metal place for this to fit, and maybe they did. This machine may have done, I forget the term they use, but I think a pounding thing where this water wheel would somehow back in there's a cog that lifts this one up. You'd throw stuff in and slam it back down. Same thing with this thing right here, see? Must have made a lot of noise and probably been a tad dangerous. And these may be those teeth that were caught by the teeth on the shaft of the water wheel, lifted them up and down. This is a very solid wood. Nice little modest room. But I mean, how much space do you need, particularly in primitive times? Piers would have been surrounding that when it was cold. And notice this stringy looking limb here is actually grooved. It was a way to carry a small rivulet of water to something, probably for lubrication. And then this log hollowed out for a sizable movement of water down into that conical device for whatever the fulling and cleaning function was. Can't get over what a pretty surrounding it is with the birds chirping and the flowers are growing. The weed as tall as an elephant's eye. Wait a minute, there isn't any weed. What's interesting is these conical devices don't look like they have any connection with the mechanical. It's like they just receive water, and I don't know what happens inside of them. This is kind of interesting to see how they have sculpted the end of this shaft out of wood. It's got to be a very weak and quickly deteriorating design out of wood. So 2 fulling cylinders and 2 whirlpools. The conical things must be the whirlpools. Here a whirlpool and a substantial stone building. So a felting drum and a whirlpool. So here's where they lived. Comfortable enough. I mean, you put modern amenities in here, reasonably modern. What more do you need? These are somehow authentic blankets. There's something that's different about these are the teeth that are hanging down. So they probably grabbed some of that, tossing it up in like a washing machine. And here, this looks like it's an oven. So perhaps a lot of heat was important in here. Here's a cute little bridge, but I'm not sure that the design helps or hinders getting across. So here's a paddle wheel type of water wheel. And you can see that as this thing rotates, I think it has some effect. Oh, kicks these things. It looks like it's going to kick that thing that way, causing it to, the thing above us to rotate that way. And there's the fulling cone underneath here, a little bit more intricately designed end pieces, and it appears that they had a wattling mesh in them. So maybe it's how the stuff that got beaten up above got drained out. The water. Again, here's a little bit of water coming in for some purpose. And those are the big devices that did the hammering. Man, that must have been something to watch. Now, I don't know if the hammering took place directly underneath those what look like hammers or not. It looks like those are in a purposely designed kind of a cavity. If you see that part that's vertical and to the right of those hammer faces. Now, that's a pretty modest little cone, and notice it doesn't go to as radical a cone as the others. And we get a nice look at this water wheel, the shaft, and going in there to that end, the working end, if you will, or the other working end, probably geared to to cause whatever took place up there. Well, this is a fairly large complex, not just a individual mill. Wow, what a piece of machinery. Imagine what the hell this thing did. Is it possible that this made some kind of fabric? All of these drums seem to be have teeth on them, very fine teeth, like they functioned like a cotton gin somehow. Maybe they did something to the fabric, but fabric's woven, so I don't know what this thing did. This one is smooth, but it looks like something was inside of it that did work, not that shield itself. Okay, this thing has very big teeth on it, like a ½ an inch long, whereas these things are sometimes a 1/16 of an inch long. Here you get that belt-driven function using wooden wheels, ironically. They're a very sizable drum, but look at the small sprocket. And here are a bunch of old belts. Now, these belts are made out of fabric. Remember, in the 1800s, we used buffalo. That's part of the reason they were slaughtered. So here was the home or dormitory or whatever of those who worked. So that bin up there, drum, suggests something was being ground in there. And these may be earlier versions of the more complex machines we were just looking at. But notice how this is an arched area that flows back and forth, back and forth. And here there are teeth. So somehow, some way, it is cleaning things up like a cotton gin does. Wish on the internet I could find drawings or something that would explain how this worked. Here what looks is a stone building with the water wheel. So it looks like things were beaten there. Probably those verticals, those slanting things would kick back and forth like that and kept slamming back into this huge piece of wood right here, into those two square-like cavities. And then who knows what that was for, mixing things or turning stuff. It's funny though, that just looks like a grinding chute above it, or a bin that channeled stuff down into it. Can't tell. I'm sure if you had a diagram or something, but notice it was necessary for some reason to have something being cooked. This has its own protection, so I don't know what it was unless it was a sheltered drinking trough for animals. And notice that it has two water wheels. The only thing I notice interesting in here is that board with those nails sticking up like cotton gin hooks. Another sloshing machine. Here we have another example of the water wheel, which is probably to our right, kicking these long levers up and down and pounding whatever is in this, for lack of a better term, dugout canoe bin. Although there's our water thing there, there's a water power. So what we have here is the water wheel axle, and you can see those two knobs right where they come together like that, see? Okay, as that thing rotated, it would lift up these hammers that are on these long shafts and drop them down so that whatever was between the hammerhead and inside of this, call it a dugout canoe bin, would get slammed, and that's apparently part of the process, whatever that was. Again, looking at this building, all is starting to get kind of redundant, of course, if you're watching it, equally so for me. But why a small water wheel? How did it vary in the power? How did you make the size or the width relative to the water flow. How did those factors relate to equal a power unit of out? Notice the type of shingles is used here, very long ones. And also how they are used. It would look like water could just flow in at a diagonal. Well, this guy got robbed. He didn't get much of a size room to live in. This again, that substantial cauldron there. And here, again, that sizable hammers that are raised up by that shaft. So we're seeing the same thing over and over again. I wonder what justifies the multiplicity of what seem to be the same kind of machine. And now we're climbing up into a residential area. It looks like a cellar. Been recreated. And there's more down below us. And off in that direction, they're doing a nice job of upgrading this with this road here for pedestrian use. So I've seen a lot of this kind of thing in Bucharest, so I'm now going to just scoot through here quickly looking for what's novel. I'm guessing this might be a town well that can pull up 2 buckets at one time, or one big one on 2 ropes. The sheep had a nice touch, don't they? A little bit different design wattle fence. Notice that great overhang. A pretty church. Better look at that. Okay, we're now entering the church. See the carving along the side here. I don't know if these paintings were restored or not, but they're in excellent condition. Pretty impressive for an old wooden church. Pretty chandelier. It looks like it's made out of wood, which would make sense. My guess, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve again. Remember, for the illiterate, it's this kind of art that explains religion and life. Here's a pretty little chapel. It might have been one of those roadside chapels rather than something inside the community. You live as brutal and primitive a life as these folks might have lived. Religion is very, very important. Just looks like the folks left for a few months for some reason. Would have been a pretty house for sure when it was new. The envy of those in Jackson. Nice design. Had a cellar in it. I don't know what this is for. Obviously mobile, but what it's for, I don't know. Probably was the entrance to some village. So we're looking out of the museum part of the park into the vastness of the park itself. Pretty looking building. Reminds you of a church, but I don't know what it is. Nope. But this was a gate entry, which probably meant that there were walls going off to the sides, and it might have been the entry into a compound. Another pretty church. Another section. This is the part of the residential section, or a continuation of it. This is a pretty little compound because of the conical thatched roofs, not terribly novel, and also this plaster covered probably log home, but with the arched front, which is interesting. It's an interesting gate. It's a sliding gate. We'll go and take a look at it. This gentleman detected it. Would not be something unusual to use in the States. You see how it's designed. It'll be a little bit difficult to use because if it gets out of alignment, it isn't going to move easily. Community monument. But what's interesting is that covering that they put on, this one with metal, but they could do it with wood. Same wood they used on the wagons where the stirrup innovation was. A pretty collection of buildings, a two-story on whitewashed rock. And then this pretty little building here to the left. And here a water-driven sawmill. Your saw blade operated by probably some kind of series of gears. And then this trolley that would hold your logs and allow you to move them forward and backward. This would be an easier way to make those slab-sided cabins for sure. I'm trying to see how this works. And what you've got is the saw attached to this thing, which is then attached to that and there, and so it moves up and down. But it doesn't move that far, probably about 1.5 feet. So not much of your blade's getting used. Maybe you can adjust the trolley height up above to get more use out of that blade. There's here a stone flywheel. In fact, 2 wheels, although that's probably for the belt drive. Again, the irony that that's wood, and then the shaft on the axle is metal. So much of what we see simply represents a transition period in all technologies, which is always the case. Staying ahead of the curve. This is belt driven. It looks like it's in place. And what was it for in a mill? Here, frankly, just a table saw. Some pretty nifty teeth. Here, the mill, we can see how the logs placed and held in place. Maybe out here on this deck they stacked the cut lumber. What an energy-saving device this was for those poor bastards that had to cut logs like this by hand, as they did at Lake Bennett on the Yukon, making boats for the first ride down the Yukon by the Klondikers. That, I think, is the robin. Pretty just walking on this new earthen path through the woods. A little stream down below. This is interesting because it sits up high on these pylons. Notice that this is using those horizontal wheels, and it is definitely for grinding. There's the grinding stones, 2 of them. Put the wheat or whatever it is in there, and it grinds through and filters out through there, I guess, into here. Yeah, you can see there's just a little chute. That probably required somebody to stand around and keep poking at it. You wonder how fast they ground down their teeth using these technologies. This is probably not a very hard stone. This is a separate device used by one man for some purpose. I don't know what. But this one like that. So now on bus 13, which will take me directly into Piazza Uniti. I think these are actually pruned and trained this way, like bonsai. Here you can buy the bulbs of your choice. Sibiu should be prettier because of this in the coming weeks. The station is back through there. I'm just taking a different route back up to the tourist center. just for the fun of seeing what I might see, and first thing I've seen is this pretty little park, and it is pretty nicely shaded. And through the blue street signs you can see 3 of those towers. And the Haller Tower, the big bastion, is to the left of us, up there way. Now the 5 o'clock version as I start for the train station and into Bucharest. And here's our last view of Piața Mare. This is the 6:05 direct train to Bucharest from Sibiu, and it's a pretty nice train. This should be second class, and this should be my seat number 82. But a guy earlier who was working on the cars told me it was the car behind me, but that looks like first class. Conductor guy confirmed that I'm in the right car, in the right seat, going to the right place. I hope. And we roll out of Sibiu, ironically, or curiously, exactly on time. These are some of the mountains I probably saw when I was coming out of Bucharest. They're designed to rotate, horizontally. I'm surprised there's a substantial lumber industry in these forested mountains. Stopped at a non-train station, I believe, just alongside the track, where there's probably this small village just to pick up some people, probably. Don't know that this would happen in France or Italy or England. Certainly almost look like minarets. Magnificent mountains that backdrop these communities in this This is a little bit classier train. The toilet works and it's clean. There's toilet paper. And there's actually water that comes out of there. It may even be a heater, and it's got lights, so that's nice. There's a little lady sitting up front, an old lady, bent over, dressed in black. She may even be a nun, I don't know. She has a large prayer book on her table, and she's reading a little book. It's interesting how train stations may represent the town, kind of like a receptionist represents, whether you like it or not, your company, because that's the face you put on your company when a visitor arrives. This is a very pretty station. Nice building, maintained, beautiful grounds. And every station has a station master or mistress. So we're arriving in Brasov again, and then down to Bucharest from there.
Dacă pleacă la 3 ceva, nu cum a rămas cu